great to be here, and particularly looking forward to the conference later on in the week. Today, I want to talk about shifting geographies of trade in relation to global value chains, arguing that we need to think about moving beyond a dominant focus on south-north oriented global value chains to recognize what is increasingly a context of polycentric trade with very and growing significance for domestic, regional, and south-south trade, as well as south-north oriented trade. And in that context, that we need to think about state roles in terms of promoting development within global value chains that go beyond just sort of facilitating actors trying to supply end markets in the global north, to recognize a variety of different end markets, including actors participating in domestic, regional, south-south trade, and a variety of state roles that include state regulation, state producers through state-owned companies, and also actually in some sectors, very significant the role of the state as a buyer in global value chains in the form of public procurement. Very significant for some domestic value chains in certain industries. So I'm going to talk a bit in the beginning more about this changing geographies of trade, the rise of polycentric trade, then what this means for how we think of the role of the state, and try and bring in some brief examples from some of my research on the pharmaceutical industry towards the end. They'll be relatively brief, but there's plenty of opportunity to expand as we go through some of the discussion. So just very briefly in the beginning, I think some of the sort of dominant conceptualization of upgrading or development within global value chains. This is somewhat of a stylized representation, but one that I think still holds in much of our understanding of global value chains, dating from the sort of original interest in global commodity chains, right through from world systems theory, a focus on this trade and supply from producers in the global south, supplying markets ultimately for consumers in the global north. Within that context, many researchers, policymakers, etc., have tried to understand how can suppliers, producers in the global south upgrade, essentially do better, get better development outcomes from participating in this south-north oriented trade. Some of the Gary Geographies 1999 article, Industrial Upgrading in East Asia, perhaps one of the key initial pieces on understanding upgrading based on textile and garments in East Asia. Different types of upgrading, but his key emphasis was that participating in global commodity chains is a necessary step for industrial upgrading because it puts firms and economies on potentially dynamic learning curves. And since then, there's a whole stream of different value chain oriented research and more recently development interventions that are trying to facilitate producers within these global value chains dominated by, coordinated, governed by a global lead firm, one based in the global north, a European, North American lead firm who controls the value chain and trying to do better for the suppliers. So much of the emphasis then becomes in understanding private governance, partly reflecting the realities of the time, sometimes referred to as a retreat of the state, which others have obviously since shown there was a retreat in some areas, but also an expansion into other areas, and a general, with a more neoliberal economic context, a shifting role of the state away from sort of key control and regulation in certain sectors. So reflecting this more liberalized economic environment, the interest becomes in understanding the role of key major lead firms in shaping development outcomes rather than necessarily nation states in particular countries, which had been the focus in much of the developmental state or wider political economy literature. So there's sort of a statement here which I think represents somewhat more of the broader understanding within global commodity chain research and global value chain research, that given governments of industrializing countries have limited power to get the institutions right, the question becomes how firms can use their participation in global commodity chains to pursue developmental goals. So very much then a shift away from an interest in the role of the state towards this novel form of private governance, which for good reasons this was a key focus at the time, in that it was relatively novel at the time that these major global companies were playing such a key role in shaping local producers' outcomes in many parts of the world, much more perhaps than their national government was. So global lead firms become significant focus of interest, and there's an interest in these various different types of upgrading. A whole variety of research, particularly in the African context, then looking at the challenges for African producers participating in global value chains. Stefano Ponti and Peter Gibbons' book, a whole variety of research on the standards, difficulty in the entry barriers, and also exclusion for many producers. Peter Dannenberg and Gilbert Nduru, their work on informalization and different strategies that producers have had to do to try and negotiate around these entry barriers, and difficulty in supplying these south-north oriented value chains, and difficulty in actually getting beneficial development outcomes from them. So the whole stream of sort of research on value chains in the African context in that way. But now we have a whole sort of variety of other factors which we need to consider too. So we get a whole focus on intra-regional value chains within the African context. Part of the question for some of this is how much of these are aspirations and how much are actual current manifestations of reality. But the East African Communities Industrialization Plan 2012 to 2032, one of its key principles is to promote strategic, targeted regional industry value chains with widespread linkages and economic benefits extending across the region. And there's a few different key sectors for this. Agro-processing is one. Pharmaceuticals, which I do some research on, is another. Regional value chains have also become a focus for UNECA in the North African context. They're also focused on, to some degree, in West Africa. This piece here from the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development, arguing regional before global. In addition to that, we have the rise of a growing expansion of consumption by middle classes within sub-Saharan Africa. So the rise of African retailers and regional value chains coordinated by these supermarkets such as ShopRite, Tuskys Uchumi, others. Nakumat had been expanding a lot, but has recently closed down. So, but there is this emergence of regional value chains in this context to supply the growing purchasing power within sub-Saharan Africa. In addition to that, we have a whole variety of other research, largely outside the field of global value chains, which is highlighted and looked for over a decade now at the emerging role of China and to a lesser extent the other BRIC countries within sub-Saharan Africa. And this, again, framing sometimes around the new colonialists, the new scramble for Africa, this sort of new forms of dependency that may emerge on the one hand. On the other hand, there's the idea of South-South trade, South-South cooperation, win-win ideas around South-South that have been invoked in relation to this new geography of trade, that compared to the very unequal trade between very different partners, it's often characterized as North-South trade, that maybe trade between countries within the global South may be more beneficial. So there's two different visions that sort of emerge, geopolitical visions that emerge for this new geography of trade, the neo-colonialism versus the win-win South-South idea. But very little of these dynamics in terms of intra-regional value chains, growing domestic consumption, the rise of the BRICS in Africa, these are sort of factors which have changed since this original interest in and understanding of value chains in the African context, I'd argue. Just a few very basic statistics about the changing geography of African trade, particularly here just comparing 1995 and 2015. We have a big reduction in the extent of exports that go to developed economies, from 72.8% in 1995 down to less than 50% in 2015. So that now more exports from African countries go to other developing countries than go to the global north. This is very, very sort of different than and an important factor to consider when we think about value chains and value chain development initiatives often being focused on supplying end markets in the global north, but actually for the majority of exporters, it's end markets within the global south that are actually now numerically more significant in terms of exports. In terms of imports, we actually have an even larger share of imports into African countries which come from other countries in the global south. About 56% in 2015, a big increase in share from 32% in 1995. So, really important to consider actually where are exports going to when we're trying to think about global value chains, and also when we're trying to develop, and there's an interest in developing local industries, that much of these local industries are now not actually trying to substitute for imports from the global north, but are actually trying to be competitive vis-a-vis imports from other countries within the global south. This is very significant in the pharmaceutical industry, where relatively lower cost generic medicines from India characterize and are a dominant part of the industry in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's a big challenge for aspiring local pharmaceutical producers in a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa to actually be cost competitive vis-a-vis the relatively lower cost pharmaceuticals which are imported from India. If we just break down this changing geography of African trade a little bit further, we can see that Europe is still the major export destination for African exports. But there's been about a 15% fall in that share since 1995 in the last 20 years. Much of that share has gone in terms of an increase in exports to China, which has had about a 9% increase, but there's also actually a big increase in intra-African trade, from about 12% of African exports in 1995 to now towards 18%. And even though we think of China as a major emerging market, a major site of growing consumption and purchasing power, actually for African exporters, other African economies are a much larger, they're a much more significant export destination than actually supplying to China. So there's a big decline in general in Europe and North America, and a huge increase in exports to China within Africa, and also to Western Asia, and to a smaller extent to Latin America. Imports, big decline in the share of imports coming from Europe, and actually a much bigger significance than for exports is imports from China, from 2% to almost 18%, and imports from China actually much greater than imports from elsewhere in Africa. But big changes in the last 20 years in terms of the geography of Africa's trade, and very important to think about how this patterns may or may not continue when we're thinking of future rural Africa or future Africas more generally. This pattern for sub-Saharan Africa is not just distinct to sub-Saharan Africa, it partly reflects a much wider change in the geography of trade. This chart is just looking at developing economies trade by partner from 1995 to 2015. The blue line is developing economies, and the red line is developed and transition economies. Now, about 60% of developing economies trade is with other developing economies, whereas it was approximately 40% 20 years ago. So again, this wider pattern that South-South trade, not just for within sub-Saharan Africa, but more widely and other developing countries are much more important export markets and sources of imports than developing countries' imports or exports. Part of this South-South trade is actually still very much connected to global value chains. So about 75 to 80% of South-South trade is actually composed of intra-regional trade within East Asia. So you have trade amongst countries in Southeast Asia that is in parts of products that are ultimately still actually going to be consumed in northern end markets. Electronics industry would be one example where you get parts that come from multiple countries, but the ultimate consumption is in a northern end market. There's other examples. Yannis Tessman has interesting work on the cashew value chain, which involves raw cashew from Ivory Coast, which then goes to India for processing, some of which is finally consumed in the global north. But there's also a big increase in final demand in the global south. And this second chart up here is based on these new OECD TIVA trade data, which is the trade in value added data, a relatively new trade data set, which is trying to avoid the double counting that's present in older trade statistics and to have new statistics that more accurately reflect global value chains and to avoid some of the earlier double counting. So this chart is showing where the value added that's created in China and India and Brazil that goes abroad, whether it is actually going to consumption in the value added in China, India, and Brazil is going to supply consumers in the global north or in the global south. And there's a big increase in the percentage of value added created in China, India, and Brazil, which is now actually serving the final purchases of consumers elsewhere in the global south. So Brazil is actually the most, up towards nearly 60%. India, the red line, is just under 50%, and China is approximately 40% of the value added exported from China is actually going to consumption elsewhere in the global south. So we can't just assume South-South trade is intermediates trade serving global value chains. A key part of it is actually serving consumers and end markets within the global south. So given this geography of trade is changing, what does this mean for our conceptualization of global value chains and global production networks? And so building on some earlier interest in, and more, well, relatively recent interest actually in shifting end markets, myself and my colleague Khalid Nadvi have been arguing that we need to think more about now of an era of polycentric trade and thinking about multiple value chains and production networks oriented towards different end markets rather than just lumping everything together under the idea of global value chains. So beyond the dominant north-south orientation, which characterizes much of our understanding of global value chains, southern producers serving northern end markets, and this north-south orientation is a very dominant one in much of the value chain literature. This is just a quote extracted from a piece in Review of International Political Economy by Jeff Nielsen and colleagues in 2014, that a key feature of global economic reorganization presented in these conceptual models is outsourcing by lead firms in developed countries of their peripheral and frequent low-value productive functions to low-cost countries and regions. So we still tend to think of value chains and production networks offshoring from developed economies to lower cost locations within the global south. Instead, we suggest we need to think more about multiple value chains and production networks, global, domestic, and regional, under polycentric trade, and the consequent governance dynamics and possibilities for upgrading or value capture trajectories. So this means taking more seriously in the conceptualization these end markets within the global south, including domestic and regional. So we often talk about global value chain, but maybe it's that the G doesn't necessarily always go with the VC or the PN, and we actually need to think about R&D, not research and development, but regional and domestic, in this case, regional value chains and domestic value chains. And often I think actually this G part of GVC or GPN has actually been given less critical attention than what we mean by the VC or the PN, and many geographers have got caught up in debates about the difference between a value chain and a production network, but much less about whether global value chains are actually really global or not. So just one example of sort of less attention to the scale or the G part of the definition, UNIDO's 2016 Industrial Development Report defines a global value chain as the full range of activities that firms and workers do to bring a product from its conception to its use, end use and beyond. This includes activities such as design, production, marketing, distribution, and support to the final consumer. But there's actually nothing in that definition at all that says what makes that global in any way at all. It's basically a definition of a value chain, not a definition of a global value chain. Even when we think of the definition in Henry Young and Neil Coe's recent work on Global Production Networks 2.0, they define a global production network as an organizational arrangement comprising interconnected economic and non-economic actors coordinated by a global lead firm and producing goods or services across multiple geographic locations for worldwide markets. So there's this tendency to see things as multi-scalar for global markets, etc. But we think actually that these different markets can have quite different requirements, quite different value chains, which can actually require quite different interventions in terms of state support, meaning that there's some value in actually teasing out the different global from the domestic and the regional. There's different interpretations of whether you actually can have a true domestic or a true regional value chain. So some would say that, well, most value chains, when you really break down every single part of it, there's nearly always some kind of component influence from outside the region. And that's the same for whether we can actually think of a domestic value chain too, that in some ingredient from somewhere, some influence in terms of ownership, in terms of foreign shareholding, maybe from outside that particular territory. But we focus in trying to define domestic and regional value chains more on where the end market and where the consumption is. So whether suppliers are supplying end market for consumers within that particular country for a domestic value chain, and within a particular region for a regional value chain. The slightly confusing part for, particularly for geographers here, being that in the policy world, regional value chains have become used to refer to supranational regions rather than subnational regions, which we often use the term region for in relation to economic geography. So here we're sort of following this wider discussion where regional seems to have been adopted for the supranational regions, so East Africa, Southeast Asia, etc., rather than for a subnational region within a country. So how might governance dynamics of these value chains be different when we think now more about polycentric trade, about these multiple value chains? Stefano Ponte and Tim Sturgeon have some interesting recent work about multipolar governance, recognizing that a single value chain may actually have multiple types of governance that are operating simultaneously, particularly if we break down to the micro level within a value chain. Between one linkage, there might be a certain type of governance operating, then the meso level across a certain section of the chain, and the macro level, the type of governance characterizing the whole chain. So they've said that there's actually different types of governance often going on within a single value chain, whether we make the generalization of the chain as a whole or look at the individual linkage. But that's still focused on one single type of value chain. There can be actually some new players playing a role in this same game of governing global value chains, as in major lead firms that are emerging from countries in the Global South. So this is just one brief illustration of the changing composition of the global Fortune 500 by headquarters from the year 2000 to 2015. And perhaps the key standout overall is that now of the global Fortune 500, we have 98 Chinese firms, whereas there was only 10 in the year 2000. And a broader shift of 30.4% of the global Fortune 500 now being actually headquartered in developing economies, what the United Nations classifies as developing economies, compared to only 6.6% in the year 2000. So the key thing here is, well, how do these lead firms from the Global South govern their value chains, and what are the development implications for suppliers participating in these value chains? So much of our understanding of governance is based on how, for example, supermarkets, retailers, garment producers from Europe or North America operate through outsourcing, etc. But do lead firms from China to and then also perhaps India, Brazil, do they actually outsource? Do they outsource across continents in the same way that lead firms do from the global north? And I think so that this is potentially quite significant in terms of changing the governance dynamics of global value chains in terms of private governance. So there can be new players sort of governing single value chains, but also we suggest that the game of governing global value chains may change as well, because we have these overlapping forms of governance. So you have producers actually need to meet requirements for global value chains to certain countries, but also maybe very different requirements for regional or domestic value chains. One of the key distinguishing features in terms of why these requirements might be very different according to different end market is different standards requirements. So the initial work highlighting very different standards requirements, or that got quite a bit of attention, Rafi Kaplinsky and colleagues arguing that when the end market shifts to the global south, there is a big decrease in standards requirement in terms of quality, labor, environmental requirement that producers are asked to meet. And so therefore, one example would be in the pharmaceutical industry. Local producers in India or in sub-Saharan Africa, it only costs a fraction to produce to the local quality standard the same drug compared to produce a pharmaceutical for a European or North American end market. And the implication in that industry is actually the difference in cost and quality requirement is so stark that the same company, a company will produce the same drug from two different facilities. One to European North American standard, another facility for a local or other developing country market, because the end market requirements are so different. Essentially, you operate and have two parallel types of production oriented towards two different types of requirements. But in terms of these standards requirements, actually a growing body of work has highlighted the growth of standards and the growth of Southern standards in terms of shaping labor, environmental, quality requirements. Annika Surmaier and Simone Strombach have an interesting paper about fair trade in tourism, the South African initiative on developing a localized fair trade standard for tourism in that sector. We could think of the Indonesian sustainable palm oil, or Trustee, a tea standard shaping tea production that has been developed within India. So there's emerging Southern standards, which mean that we also have to complicate this idea of Northern high standards and Southern low standards. But nevertheless, there are often different standards requirements, which mean that actually there is quite important distinguishing features, that everything can't just be lumped into a global value chain, and that any kind of development intervention may be quite different if you're thinking about helping suppliers reach the standard requirement for a European North American market versus if you're thinking about helping suppliers meet a standards requirement for a another southern end market. And actually there, the standard may not be the barrier to entering into that market. It may be other issues of highly competitive, low-cost production from large emerging economies and working out how to compete with that, rather than actually the standard and meeting standards being the barrier and therefore the necessary focus for development intervention. In terms of upgrading, perhaps we need to think of development strategies within multiple value chains, and this being raising some new issues compared to just thinking about these global value chains. So suppliers really, and thinking about which end market with which requirements, and also similarly for any global value or any value chain oriented development intervention. And many suppliers and producers do pay huge attention to domestic, regional, and other southern markets. Indian pharmaceutical industry, many producers have told me that the level of competition domestically within India is so strong, and that the entry barrier in terms of the standard to supply Europe and North America is so high that actually the most attractive business opportunity is to try and supply other developing country markets where neither the standard is too high nor the competition is too great relative to what they see domestically. And many producers do concentrate on these markets beyond the global north, which I don't know how much that is actually considered in relation to our prevailing conceptualization of global value chain. There's also important questions about chain switching. So how easily can producers switch supply from one end market to another? And this can vary quite considerably between different industries. Some industries having relatively standardized products that can be sent to different end markets. The pharmaceutical industry, where much of my research is based, actually such stark standards requirement difference between the two that you're very unlikely to actually quickly switch production from a northern end market to a southern end market. So important questions then about how easily can suppliers diversify. Stephanie Barrientos and colleagues' work about strategic diversification. Also whether suppliers may actually deliberately exit certain global value chains if the benefits aren't good, and actually instead target domestic or regional value chains where perhaps the opportunities for functional upgrading or moving into new activities such as processing may be greater than that found in global value chains, where oftentimes global lead firms can want a supplier to persist in a relatively dependent basic supplier role rather than to actually upgrade into more advanced activities. So just to summarize what we think some of this sort of new context of global value chains in the context of new geography of trade is that we're thinking much more now about multiple value chains and multiple end markets rather than a sort of singular dominant global north-south orientation, as well as northern lead firms playing key governance roles. We have global, regional and domestic lead firms, not just northern standards, but also different variations with southern standards, a variety of different types of governance dynamics, but particularly thinking about multipolar governance. And also then very important questions to consider in terms of how economic, social, and environmental outcomes vary across these multiple different chains. So as a more pictorial representation of this, what we're trying to suggest is that the reality is somewhat shifted, and this is particularly true when we consider that shifting geography of African trade, that from this south-north orientation to actually this considerable expansion of southern end markets, which includes China, but it's not just China. It includes intra-African trade to a considerable degree as well, particularly for exports, and it also includes domestic purchasing power too. Part of the question then about governance and upgrading is, well, are these actually governed value chains in the same way that we understand major lead firms having control over the value chain in a northern north-south chain. Maybe in a southern end market, this can be more arm's length trade. So it could be a value chain, but it may not be having one dominant lead firm in the same way. And a lot of important questions about arguments sometimes that development outcomes can be much better in southern end markets because there's opportunities for functional upgrading, for moving into processing activities, etc. But at the same time, there can be intense competition amongst southern producers with clearly an increasingly heterogeneous global south where China and India can be very big competitive challenges for other suppliers in the global south to compete against. So what does this then mean for public governance? I'd suggest, much of the literature has arguably been oriented around governments playing a facilitator role in helping suppliers in the global south supply global value chains, meaning end markets in the global north, particularly recognizing these high standards requirements. How can suppliers both enter and then when they enter these chains capture more of the gains from participating within these chains? Gary Geographies has even written in his initial outline of global value chains that in the context of export-oriented development, governments are primarily facilitators in global value chains, and that partly reflected the reality at that time. Arguably, this facilitator role has been the emphasis of much global value chain-oriented development policy interventions, and more critical takes from Jeff Nielsen, Marion Werner, and other colleagues have argued that this promoting business enabling environment, making markets work, is how value chains has been interpreted within development policy, but particularly focused on facilitating global value chains through various mechanisms, transport and communication facilities, export processing zones, credit facilities, tax breaks, etc. So perhaps this is a sort of dominant way, and we see many different infrastructure developments, other incentives to try and supposedly facilitate participation in global value chains. Of course, there's often very significant questions about facilitating whom, whether this is actually facilitating global lead firms, or is it facilitating higher capability, more well-endowed domestic firms or farmers, rather than small-scale producers or farmers who are likely to have quite different requirements. But also facilitating which types of chains to enter. The barriers and challenges in chains oriented towards global end markets are likely to actually be considerably different from those in chains that are perhaps aspiring domestic value chains or aspiring regional value chains. So as well as this facilitator role, there's also important regulator role, producer role, and buyer role to consider. And actually a growing body of work is looking a lot more at this regulator role, which we could think of as maybe measures that limit and restrict the activities of firms within GPNs. So regulation and governance has so often been understood in terms of private governance within global value chains, but actually a growing body of work looking at how private governance relates to public governance. Does private governance sometimes substitute for public governance? So you have global lead firms who set certain labor and environmental conditions in their chains, meaning that it absolves states from actually making any initiatives in that regard, or can it actually, private governance, complement and promote public governance? Producer state-owned firms are very, very significant, particularly in certain industries, but also in certain geographic contexts. So China, many of the major firms are state-owned. So there's actually supplying a Chinese state-owned company is a key example of public governance in global value chains. The buyer role as well, though, where the end market is not actually a major global firm in Europe or North America, the end market may actually be the domestic government, where in certain industries, pharmaceutical industry in sub-Saharan Africa, in many countries, the government is actually comprises 50% of the market. 50% of pharmaceuticals market is public procurement. So a key factor there in terms of developing a domestic local production or domestic value chain is whether the government actually buys from locally produced medicines or buys from imported drugs. The regulator role, and I think there's various factors which affect the regulator role. So partly you have a context of deregulation, but there's often also a lack of political will in whether regulation actually takes place or not. But there are still a whole variety of regulatory roles which do take place and to varying degrees, particularly sometimes invoked in relation to national security, in certain industries related to critical infrastructure, strategic enterprises. And this important question of whether this is actually substitutes or complements public governance. State-owned companies are estimated to be about 5 to 10% of global economic activity and actually 10 to 30% of many emerging economies. Particularly in economic geography, state-owned companies actually get very, very little attention, but when we're thinking about value chains, they do have their own sourcing requirements and can be very significant in certain sectors, yet are largely overlooked. And even though there's sort of an assumption that state-owned companies were a thing of the past, we're actually, in many industries and in certain geographic contexts, state-owned companies are still very much a part of the present. And finally then on the buyer role, some estimates suggest it's actually about 13 to 20% of global GDP worldwide is public procurement. And there are WTO agreements on trying to prevent domestic bias in public procurement, trying to make public procurement open to suppliers from foreign-owned suppliers, but there's a very big bias still present in much public procurement, that most public procurement does go to local producers and is a key opportunity for actually developing domestic industries, partly because that is actually, it's not, that's more an optional agreement rather than an absolutely mandatory to the implementation of the agreement on public procurement. So within the pharmaceutical industry, the policy area where suppliers are incredibly interested in and focused on in terms of what could actually promote local production more is if their national government would buy more medicines from local producers. But then there's a tension that comes in there that the national government has both a Ministry of Industry, which wants local production, but it also has a Ministry of Health, which wants the most highest quality medicines for the best price it can get, and where there's often a tension between the Ministry of Health feeling like it can get a much better bang for its buck from imported medicines compared to what can sometimes be more expensive local production. So these are sort of three roles where the regulator role gets attention, but other roles which are actually, particularly when we think of domestic and regional value chains, which are actually very significant in certain contexts. So just for the last couple of minutes to just very briefly, in the context of the pharmaceutical industry, how these roles and shifting end markets play out. There's been a number of initiatives over the last 10 to 15 years to promote greater local pharmaceutical production within sub-Saharan Africa. This map is from the WHO's World Medicine Situation in 2004. The green showing countries with larger percentages of medicines produced domestically, and the darker gray countries which are almost completely dependent on imports of medicines, which is the context for sub-Saharan Africa. So the African Union and different regional blocs have had a variety of initiatives to promote local production of pharmaceuticals. And actually regional blocs being particularly key, given that the industry has often quite key regulatory requirements, and in a continent where you're split up into 54 different markets, it creates quite small markets. The idea being if you have regional coordination, regional markets, it might promote and incentivize more investment in local production when you have a larger market. But the real challenge for local pharmaceutical production is not how to supply export-oriented products to the global north. It's how to compete with market-seeking imports primarily from India and to a lesser extent China, where 80 to 90% of the pharmaceuticals in both the public market and the private market in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa is comprised of imports from India and China. Oftentimes the actual raw materials and active pharmaceutical ingredients, the active pharmaceutical ingredient being the key chemical incipient in the body, which actually makes a sort of difference in terms of when somebody has a health issue, the formulation being whether that is then put into a liquid, into a tablet, into a capsule for consumption. Much of these first two stages often taking place in China, the formulation stage taking place in India, the distribution and marketing taking place within sub-Saharan Africa. But there being no active pharmaceutical ingredient production in sub-Saharan Africa means many suppliers who are trying to expand in the formulation stage are still dependent on API supply from elsewhere. So the fact that you have much larger scale production, particularly in India, is actually a very, very big competitive challenge. And many Indian suppliers then seeing relatively little attractiveness in actually establishing local production, given the economies of scale and the integrated value chain and supplier-related activities which are available within India. So in this context, it's arguably industrialization and to some extent even deindustrialization is a challenge in an era of global value chains. Where India's pharmacy to the developing world, these south-south value chains can actually crowd out attempts at local production. On the other hand, though, most of the most successful examples of local pharmaceutical production actually involve tie-ups and various collaboration where you have relationships and supply relationships with India, which are necessary in terms of providing the ingredients and technology. So the policy initiatives then are very, very different from just facilitating production oriented towards northern end markets. There's a lot of regional plans. East African Community really been trying to create a regional pharmaceutical market to promote local production. But even in that context is an important question of, well, local production for who? So Kenya, when Uganda has actually produced WHO qualified antiretrovirals, they've had to do a lot of diplomatic work to get Kenya to buy those medicines that are produced in Kampala rather than for those medicines to still be imported from India. So sometimes Kenya may not see something produced in Uganda as local because what's local for Kenya is within the domestic market, not necessarily elsewhere in East Africa. So even though there's a lot of plans around creating regional value chains within pharmaceuticals in East Africa, to a large extent, there's still a lot of national variation in responses to these initiatives, and also tension between different countries, but also even tensions within countries in terms of actually whether you're taking a health perspective or an industry perspective. So there's a sense that regional value chains, they're important to consider, but they're also not necessarily a sort of the answer to definitely guaranteed to produce better development outcomes than global value chains. They also have their own challenges in terms of competitiveness and tensions within the global south too. In this industry, the state as buyer is the really crucial leverage point which many producers see in terms of facilitating local industry. So to conclude, I'm trying to suggest that there's and many varieties of different types of work are pointing to it, is that there's very different geography of trade for Africa and also the wider global south under 21st century economic globalization. Much activity extends beyond chains or networks in northern lead firm governed chains and relates to this wider context of more polycentric trade. And rather than just thinking about development interventions which are oriented towards northern end markets and facilitating producers to participate in that, we shouldn't ignore those. Those markets are still important, but there's a whole variety of other markets which have their own requirements which need to be taken very seriously. And in that context, that state roles need to adapt not just to facilitate overcoming the entry barriers in northern end markets, but also to consider these realities and challenges in southern end markets too. So yeah, this is largely based on these two papers, but that's the overview, and happy to take any questions, or yeah, looking forward to discussion.